Hey there, it's Justine. Before we launch into today's episode, I need to tell you about the Life and Faith survey. We're so glad for the responses we've already received, so thank you. We do need more responses though, so we have lots of data to work with. If you haven't yet taken the survey, then we need your input to make Life and Faith better and more fit for purpose. It will help us a lot as we shape the podcast into the future. The survey itself won't take long, probably about 5 minutes. Would you lend us 5 minutes of your time? We'd really appreciate it. We're running this for a few more weeks, and to say thank you, we'll put you in the running to win a signed copy of Tim Winton's book, Juice. Pretty good, right? All you need to do is go to the show notes to click on the link or go to the CPX website, publicchristianity.org. Thanks in advance for your help. Now on to the episode.
This week on Life and Faith.
What we have is a hidden crime and a hidden population who's being affected by types of exploitation and slavery and trafficking.
The Enlightenment is about the great individual.
I get this cold feeling in my chest, my hands go sweaty, and it's decision time.
Social media makes us see ourselves as larger than we are.
How can I convince myself I'm a worthy person?
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
Now, slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834. It's almost 200 years ago. But the inhumane trade in human flesh lives on today in a new form, preying on some of the weakest members of our society, children, and through the most ordinary means you can think of, your phone. Now, just a content warning before we get into our interview today. This is not an episode to play when you've got little ones listening in, and perhaps not at all, depending on your own experiences of abuse. It is disturbing stuff. Today we're talking about the tech-enabled online sexual exploitation of children, especially children in the Philippines, and we'll be doing that by talking with our friends from International Justice Mission, or IJM. A 2023 IJM study found that 500,000, or 1 in 100 Filipino children, were trafficked to produce new sexual abuse materials in 2022. It's a shocking statistic and a sobering picture because many Australians are caught up in this crime as perpetrators. Now, Justine, this is awful stuff.
It is. It's really, really terrible. This story has received quite a bit of press coverage this year in the mainstream news, and it sounds terrible to say, but I guess the typical sex tourism story involving Australians might have like an Australian man travelling to Asia to abuse children. But the fact that we have devices around us all the time adds a whole other dimension to that story. So you have Australian men using social media platforms to arrange and pay for live-streamed abuse of minors in their home. So the men can be here at home in Australia, the children can be in their homes in the Philippines, and yet they're just not safe. We're going to be hearing more about this today from Gigi Tupas, who's the head of National Activation and Partnerships at IJM Philippines, and Grace Wong, Chief Advocacy Officer at IJM Australia. But before we jump into the topic, I wanted to get a sense of what Gigi and Grace did in their roles at IJM. So first we'll hear from Gigi Tupas. She's been with IJM since 2013, and she works with church leaders from all denominations from all over the Philippines to combat human rights violations.
My role now is like a direct journey from when I started with different denominations, talking to leaders and movers who are passionate about justice in our country. Then now in a national role that includes the church and civil society in general. So we work with non-governmental stakeholders using that resources, the influence, the goodwill, so that we can improve our justice system when it comes to being more protective to those who are easily victimized or targeted, and also bridging that access so that they will have access for those who already are victims, for survivors, in our case, the online sexual exploitation of children, for them to have access to the public justice system.
Now, meet Grace Wong, Chief Advocacy Officer at IJM Australia, who first encountered IJM as a law student and who has a legal and policy background with NGOs and the government. Grace has also done some hands-on casework with survivors of trafficking.
So it's just been a passion of mine to see people who might not have the ability to voice what is happening to them and who are basically unseen and being exploited and abused in pretty rough situations, being lifted up and given a chance to speak about that experience and use those experiences to inform how we, who are more privileged, I think, in some ways, in society, can influence and change that practice from happening all over the world. And international justice mission is just one way of doing that. What I love about it, it's systems reform. Like, yes, we do individual cases, but often the individual cases in partnership with government are the things that are the driver to change the system as a whole. They bring status to the issue, they bring status to the people who are often unseen, having been victimized, and then also provide intel and data points that help inform then, well, if this is happening on a case-by-case basis, what do we need to change at a system-wide level to make sure that this doesn't happen at a case-by-case basis? So it's kind of bottom-up, driving that data and that information and intel that we're getting to a systemic level and driving for long-term systemic change. And often our projects go for 10, 15, 20 years in countries because what we're looking for in the end result is a drop in prevalence of that particular case type that we're working on, and also a systemic adoption of trauma-informed practices and ways of dealing with that crime so that it doesn't happen anymore, or it's rare for it to happen without being detected and responded to.
Let's talk about online sexual exploitation of children. I've also heard it shortened to the acronym OSEC. Is that easier, perhaps, to adopt for our conversation? Can you tell us about the scope of the problem? You know, who does it affect? How widespread is it?
When I joined IJM, I joined in 2013. That particular casework was child sex trafficking in the bars and in the streets. And we're winding down because in that previous casework, from 20+%, it dropped to 1 to 2%, the prevalence of a child offered. And 2011, before I joined IJM, there were already like inquiries, referrals, from international law enforcement about online sexual exploitation of children. It's not called that yet. It was called by different names. And then our team started to look into it. After 2 years of studying it, at that point before 2015, there were 2,400 what the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children would call cyber tips. So a referral to a particular agency in the Philippine government, they received 2,400 referrals. And that's really an alarming number. And so we said 2016, we pivot. And now we started to work with that, as Grace was sharing, in that kind of approach with the public justice system, with the systems reform. And we did some study, we called it scale of harm. So there was a previous study and another one with IJM that really evidence-based. The Philippines is the epicenter, the global hotspot of this form of exploitation. So we said, okay, how many Filipino children are actually affected? So we did the scale of harm study in 2021. We rolled that out, and the findings is that in 2022 alone, almost 500,000 Filipino children were newly trafficked so that they can be used to produce child sexual exploitation materials. And who's demanding for this kind of exploitation, who's paying, is very connected to both our countries of Philippines and Australia, because number 3, Australia has been identified. So that's how prevalent it is right now.
And I think, just to add to that, Gigi, that trend that we're seeing in the Philippines is such a wonderful case study of sort of what's blooming at the global level. And while estimates are sketchy, Justine, and we know that they're not going to be wholly accurate because the lack of reporting is not necessarily as high as we want it to be, I think that same National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children that receives a lot of reports through the cyber tip line received like 36.2 million reports in 2023 of children being exploited or abused, and that material having been detected. And all of the local authorities here, whether it be the E-Safety Commissioner or the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, reported increases of 50 to 100 to 120% increase in reports each year that they're taking of this type of material being detected. And the most recent estimate, I think, by Childlight in 2024 is that almost 300 million across the world, so children across the world, are being affected by this and have been victimized. And so those numbers seem almost extreme. Like, how do you even figure out what 300 million children look like? And so I think Gigi's reference to our statistic of 1 in 100 children in the Philippines is a good way of trying to narrow that and see, well, okay, if I had 100 children at school, this is how many children who could potentially be at risk. And the problem then seems a little bit more tangible, a little bit more actionable. But yeah, it is overwhelming, the statistics.
I just wanted to ask you, ladies, about the Australian consumers, right? Because I've seen some press coverage, and from what I can tell, these are often married, very ordinary parents, often dads, with their own kids as well. What do we know about the people driving the demand for this material?
Yeah, it's a bit startling because there was some recent research that was issued by UNSW, and of course the Australian Institute of Criminology has been researching this for a while, where they found up to sort of 2% of Australian men, they predict, have viewed and watched or directed child sexual abuse material here and overseas. And so those numbers are really startling because just by sheer statistics, that is a much higher amount than what we realise. And I think that there has been lots of talk and research recently around risk factors and what is it about any of these men who might have a predisposition to offending. What is it that earlier on could have been done to potentially address the offending behaviour? Because you're right, Justine, it's not necessarily that there is this specific subset of what we already know as criminal conduct, and there within that, it does seem that there is a bit of a slow build or movement towards that conduct. And so some of the risk factors that we've isolated in research have to do with viewing of pornography, early exposure themselves to trauma and a similar form of abuse. We also have some evidence to indicate that people who have been involved in directing live streaming, for example, or viewing child abuse material online, then have a predisposition to conducting that offending in person as well. So we know it's a little bit of a slippery slope, but there's a lot more to learn. And I think the Australian government is trying to invest in a lot of measures to help address and report when those indicators and risk factors might be manifesting to try and catch that offending behaviour a bit earlier.
Can you tell us about who exactly is making this child exploitation material? Because you earlier, Gigi, talked about commercial sex trafficking of children, like maybe that's a brothel owner or something that who is facilitating that exchange. But in this case, it's far more insidious, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Every rescue operation is always bittersweet for us. We're happy that the child is taken out of the exploitative situation, but because the reality is, according to the study conducted by IJM, 41% are biological parents. The local perpetrators are biological parents, and 42% are those close relatives and friends. That means imagine 83% of the perpetrators are the trusted people who should be protecting the child inside the home, but the opposite is happening. And when we look at driving factors, yes, obviously poverty, but that's not to say that all the perpetrators are in need of money. We had cases that perpetrators are are not needing money. They have regular day jobs, but it's a risk reward kind of crime. The risk of getting caught because it's online. And if those many forms, IJM has focused on one of the difficult things, the live stream abuse, and that's really difficult. And so the risk of getting caught is low, but the reward, how many dollars in 1 hour, and if you have several customers, I mean, that's already like you're earning maybe for several months. So it's easy money. The risk reward is what unpacks it. It is really an economic crime. The money drives it, no matter what the profile of the perpetrator may be.
It's just shocking because it's the distortion of the fundamental parent-child relationship. And I've heard that sometimes when it is a poverty situation as well, then some parents will say, oh, we need this to pay for food, to pay for you to go to school, all this sort of thing. Can you tell us about what it's like for children on the other side once they've been rescued? And keeping in mind as well that maybe we're only rescuing some, right? Because it's so hard to detect.
Yeah. So that's where my role really takes on that part, Justin, a lot of partnership. It really is a network of response. The day of the rescue operation is just the beginning of accompanying this child. Imagine if you're a good parent, you know what it takes to raise up a child until they're really like independent, provided all those resources. So imagine for a newly rescued survivor of this crime, the child, everything's gone. All the support system, whatever it was, gone. And so who takes that on? It's all this network of response of partners, including government, including churches in their ministries, including NGOs with their child-focused advocacy and programming. And that's where we engage together, collaborating really on what needs for a child. Like from a rescue operation, where will the child be best placed? And one of the learnings of our aftercare team, a team of social workers who have been working for some decades, and there was a need for a comprehensive assessment place for the child. It used to be that every time a child is rescued somewhere in an exploitative or abusive situation, the go-to would be, a shelter right away, or, to get all those services. The child goes here, the next day there, it's re-traumatizing again. They came from a traumatic situation, and now just going around with all that confusion and all those emotions. So we're really grateful for our partners who took on in their ministry setting up assessment center where the newly rescued child is there. All the needs with a multidisciplinary team, social workers, lawyers from government, from that team, and then even law enforcement who needs to talk to the child will need to go there. And the child is stabilized and it's there. And how long do we accompany this child? Well, at least in my time with IJM, I know we've accompanied a survivor for 10 years until, wow, we're celebrating, graduation, all these things. But it really is a long journey towards that recovery. There's no timeline for recovering from something like that. But, I always look at the survivors and I'm so inspired that, wow, I saw them when they were rescued and now I see them, thriving, happy, smiling, laughing, and that makes it all worthwhile and that unites all of us for this.
This is Life and Faith, and we're listening to Justine's interview with Gigi Tupas from IJM Philippines and also Grace Wong from IJM Australia. Now, you've just heard Gigi speak about the coordinated efforts of a team of first responders, social workers, child advocates, police officials to attend to a child once they're rescued from online child sexual exploitation. But the conversation now turns to the way that technology facilitates the abuse of children in their own homes by their own parents through devices and tools that most of us use every day.
There's different forms of child sexual abuse online and exploitation, and the type that IJM particularly focuses on in the Philippines involves this live streaming element. So, where usual platforms for messaging and video conferencing are used by offenders who are often overseas, so Australia being one country, or UK or the US. And what they do is they direct the shows of what they want to see being done by the children, either to each other or by an adult, the trafficker to them. And those aren't necessarily recorded. Sometimes they can be, and that creates new exploitation material which can be disseminated and shared with friends. But often it's just that live streamed show in and of itself. And I think the average cost that we found in our study, scale of harm, was sort of $12 per show, was kind of the amount that was going to get these. And what we are obviously conscious of is that a lot of the detection that's being done by tech companies on their platforms isn't necessarily for the creation of this new content, this live content. They might know a lot about what is already being saved and distributed in terms of images and videos and media, but this type of content is particularly hard to detect because of that live streaming aspect.
Yeah, we will get to the tech companies in a moment, but part of this whole discussion is that there's almost like it's just online kind of defense. So in some ways, the parent or the trafficker can sort of rationalize to themselves, it somehow doesn't seem real. Is that something that you've encountered, that because this is enabled by the tech platforms that we're using in our everyday lives, and a lot of it is a virtual sort of experience, we can feel like it's not somehow as real as if it was happening in the real world?
Yeah, when we look at the footages of actual interviews, during the rescue operation, that's the excuse of the local perpetrator that, oh, it's virtual, it's not, no abuse. There is, in the live streaming form of this kind of crime, an actual abuse is really happening to the child. They're asked to do abusive things to themselves or to another child, or another adult would be doing unimaginable things, even if those people are related to them. Those are actual abuses, and that's a crime.
Yeah, I think that that is a insidious part about the online space. It's brought us together in so many different ways, closer to family, closer to friends overseas, but it unfortunately has also brought offenders closer to opportunities for people to make money in their home. You just need good internet connection, a good international payment transfer system, and also the ability to communicate somewhat in English. And you've got a vulnerability in those circumstances there that creates this expectation of, well, this is a cheap and an easy way to make additional money in my home. My children are not being abused by people who are stepping into my home. I'm not making them available at pubs or bars or clubs. This is kind of controlled by me. And I think that that folds into some of the other findings that come around community attitudes to children, to the valuing of children, to, I guess, our expectations around what is acceptable conduct with children or not, and also what does it mean to keep children safe. In a home like that, I think it is really challenging, that online expectation, because it does go to the heart of what does it mean to actually abuse? What does it actually mean to look at the consequences of that for the child and also for the person viewing it? And then how do we protect in circumstances like that when children are not necessarily being offered in public open spaces, but are being offered in their homes? And that makes it a really hard question, because that has to do with family dynamics, community reporting and awareness, and also, again, deeply ingrained attitudes around child protection and family safety.
So can you tell me then about the role of the tech giants in unwittingly or inadvertently or perhaps neglectfully allowing this to happen? Because from what I'm aware, you've got offenders and traffickers, direct messaging each other on all these platforms that we all use in our everyday lives.
The question about what they're doing in the space is that they are doing some work in the space, and we want to acknowledge that. And we want to acknowledge actually that Australia does have quite like a strong legislative framework to require them to produce information about how they're addressing what we call child sexual exploitation material or abuse material on their platforms, and what they're doing to report it to the relevant law enforcement agency. So some work is definitely being done. And as you can see from those NCMEC report numbers, they are reporting that in. I think the thing that we think could be done better by them is to go back to the point of design. So when you create the product, when you create the service or the platform, are you already thinking about ways in which it could potentially be misused to exploit or abuse children because they are so vulnerable and they're not necessarily the end user? So when you create a phone, you're probably thinking about the adult market, thinking about teenagers who might be able to use it, with appropriate adult controls. But here we're talking about children who might not be the end user, who are harmed through the misuse of platforms and services. And so part of what we want to do is kind of turn the obligation on its head. Instead of thinking about how do you catch it once it's already happened and then report that in, we want them to go back to the design phase and think, how can we build in a duty or an awareness as to safety by design at that point, so that then the products that you are issuing, the services that you are issuing already have safeguards built into them, like the seatbelt in your car or the school zone outside the school. It's just now a done thing to have those safety features built into the way that we design schools or cars. We want tech companies to do that from the beginning. And so that's part of our call. What we're looking for is a more robust regime that actually puts penalties in there so that we can see compliance across the board and genuine efforts to lift their game. Because part of the reason is that the problem is prevalent, as you know, with the numbers we quoted before, and also it's growing. And there's a way to stem the tide on things, and that's at the very beginning by preventing things. And so that's why I think, Gigi's office in IJM Philippines and IJM Australia work so closely together, because we know what happens here has an effect on the casework that they see trickling down to them there. And so it is important that we work in partnership together to get both ends of the spectrum when it's actually expressing itself in a case where children have already been harmed, and also at this point where government is asking tech sector to do something at the point of design and issuing a service or a platform.
Now, Gigi, Grace has spoken about the efforts to try and get tech companies to play nicely and design their products in such a way. Can you speak to the particular challenges posed in your context?
20 years ago, there was no anti-trafficking in persons law in the Philippines at all, but there are already, a lot of trafficking happening. I mean, the Filipinos have always been a target of that, especially the children. Then a law came, and it was not an easy one, but again, it takes all of the influence, all of goodwill of people, to be really activated, collaborating together to have that. And to date, we've already made 2 amendments to that law. And part of that is, in our country, in the law of our country, online sexual exploitation of children is very much a trafficking crime. And we have the heaviest penalty. It's life imprisonment. And if there's plea bargaining, it's still 16 years. That's still very heavy. And it's not easy to get from before to this point. Now, to specific to OSEC, what are we driving at in our side of the world is that, okay, we have this national law, but it has to be enforced down to the smallest unit of government, which is what we call barangay. Because it's happening in the homes, you want to increase community engagement, you want to increase community response, and the local law enforcement response should be timely. And that's where we are right now when it comes to children's safety, which again, the conversation with communications and tech companies, it's an ongoing conversation also in our country. It's a parallel one. It is a bit of an uphill climb, but at least the doors, are opening, and a lot of people are really joining up forces to have more control, have more accountability in this sector in our country.
Can we talk about the prospects of rehabilitation for children, especially? I mean, Gigi already spoke about one survivor that you've walked with right from the beginning, and now you've seen them graduate. But any stories that you can share of individuals that can, I guess, communicate the hard-won wins?
So one would be Cassie was rescued after being in that exploitative situation 4 years already. And that's because her sister and her mother, reported, and she was rescued. And fast forward to now, being in a child protective trauma informed with all the team and resources, Cassie is thriving. She is studying. She's about to graduate. I think she graduating this year or has graduated. So she's one of those people who are now advocating when before it's an IJM colleague who will be talking to people who are responsible for policy. Now Cassie is one of the advocates. And second, Ruby is another case. I've seen her journey, and now she's preparing to study for law, right? And she just got married, and some of our IJM colleagues were there to celebrate that. And the third one would be the Philippine Survivor Network. These are survivors of IJM supported cases whom we continued together with partners, to accompany them in their journey of independence, thriving, and they organized themselves into this group, into this community, and they're 1 year old as a network, the Philippine Survivor Network. We celebrate the survivors now who are thriving and really are experiencing joy in their lives. But of course, the goal is we hope we don't need to talk about OSEC anymore or any form of abuse, because your law here and our law in the Philippines are closing those doors for any opportunity for any perpetrator to abuse or exploit online any Filipino child or any child anywhere in the world. That is the dream and that is the vision.
Grace, earlier you'd spoke about, trying to look after the people who go unseen. Is there anything that you can extend upon with that in terms of why do this work? What's the ethos and the motivation for this work?
We have a strong tradition at IJM of looking to the past and to see great people in the past who've tried to push forward on issues that seemed untenable before. And I often think of the Methodist Church and some of the great icons who were followers of God, who referred to the Bible as a framework for knowing and understanding that each and every person has value and were good because they were created in God's image and had all of this dignity and respect attached to them, whether they were of a specific background, whether they were from Africa or any other continent or nation. So I do think that when we look at what has been done in the past through that framework, which is a very human rights framework in many ways, and we see the value and the dignity of each and every person, and then we see that what we have now is a system that is still not free from slavery or exploitation, despite its legal abolition across most of the countries of the world. What we have is a hidden crime and a hidden population who's being affected by types of exploitation and slavery and trafficking. And so I think for me in particular, to be involved in bringing people to be acknowledged and valued and respected and lifted up free from exploitation is actually such a beautiful thing to do, whether you're doing it, as Gigi mentioned, on a case-by-case basis, or you're trying to create system-wide change to actually prevent it happening in the first place. There's a great motivation there. And I think that there is always a strong push towards hope and optimism within IJM, because you cannot be overwhelmed by the numbers and thus do nothing, which I think is a worse option. Why not do something if you can do even a little bit in the time that you've got and with the resources you have? I think the principle that actually the online space creates more connections with the world applies here too. So if we are more connected to the world and to potentially greater vulnerabilities to create exploitation and abuse, so too are we closer to, to the children in the Philippines and a whole bunch of other children who are being victimized and can do something about the issue with the oversight and the understanding that we have now.
So how can people get involved in the work of IJM? What can they do right now?
Right now, we are asking people to partner with us and to continue following and understanding the issue, talking about how the issue plays into this broader debate and discussion that we're having across Australia about the role of social media and the online harms that come with social media, because it affects Australian children too. And I think if we can keep that discussion going and we show leadership and passion and a desire to influence policy and to not be apathetic about what happens to our political institutions or to Gigi's partners and the work that we do in other countries, I think that would be a great win. How about you, Gigi? Have you got something to add to that?
Yeah, so accompanying a survivor or even finding that victim to be rescued takes a lot of resources and a lot of people. And so we really invite people, if they can be freedom partners, like support our work. We need to send rescues to where the children are. And in the Philippines, my goodness, it's not just in the city. They're in far-flung areas. And it's difficult to go there and find them. And you need a lot of people and you need a lot of resources for that. And so I invite people to join us and be freedom partners, as we call it, if you want to help us do those rescue operations. The children we're talking about in the Philippines that are still needing to be taken out of that exploitative situation. So please visit the IJM Australia website and see how you can support rescues.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and also Justine Toe.
Thanks to Gigi and Grace and the work of IJM. You can find out more at www.ijm.org.au/freedom partner. There's no space in between those words. And then /. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes, as well as to other material like news reports and stories that you might want to explore further as well.
Yes, IJM is doing wonderful work on the ground. And if you found this episode of Life and Faith, well, no doubt disturbing but yet worthwhile, please do pass it on to someone else you think might get something out of it. Next week.
He got it very cheaply and then with a lot of audacity, or chutzpah we might say, said, well, it's missing too many pages for me to be able to sell it as a book. I'm going to split it up and sell it in individual leaves. This allowed collectors the opportunity to have a piece of the Gutenberg mystique without having to buy the whole Bible.